Welcome to today's episode. And Richard, I'm really excited about this episode because I think it's a hot topic. I can use the word hot topic. This year, especially, has seen a lot of countries taking a more, if I can use the word, aggressive stance in terms of their own foreign policy. And today we're discussing how does that play when we're talking about diplomatic relations and things like international development. I was especially excited about our guest, Paul Arkwright, who happens to be a former UK High Commissioner to Nigeria. Paul has over 34 years of experience within the diplomatic sphere. So you can imagine when we say that this is an in-depth conversation, it really was because he was able to give us examples across board. So those are just some of the things I'm excited about. But Richard, what did you think about today's episode?
I think it's fascinating and very timely for all the reasons you set out. I also love that this gets to the heart of the issue around economic diplomacy and the degree to which it's driven by self-interest of countries or more about mutual interest of countries. And I think with Paul, we were able to really unpack some of the dynamics that go on there and see the potential as well as the I guess the challenges. So it's really great to get Paul's insights on the podcast. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for joining us. Would you mind introducing yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, sure. My name is Paul Arkwright. I was a UK diplomat for many years, I think 34 years altogether. Traveled extensively throughout the world, mostly in Europe and the US. But at the end of my career, I ended up in Nigeria, which is where we met. And I was the British High Commissioner to Nigeria from 2015 to late 2018. And I subsequently did a couple of jobs in London focused on Africa, including as CEO of the UK Africa Investment Summit. I worked on the COP26 Climate Change Summit in Glasgow. And then I left the Foreign Office, set up my own consultancy, and at the moment I am advising companies on doing business in Africa, investing in Africa, helping them navigate the complexities of Africa. So that's what I'm up to now.
So, Paul, you are the perfect person for us to speak to about economic diplomacy.
Hi, Paul. Thank you so much. What an interesting and extensive career you have had so far. And just as Richard said, we're really excited to talk to you about economic diplomacy. So what is it exactly? When we hear the word economic diplomacy, what does it mean? And how do you think the definition and practice, how has it changed over time?
Well, I would say economic diplomacy is probably best summed up as the use of economic tools and influence to pursue foreign policy goals. Now, that can take lots of different forms. The form that I guess I practiced most was in Nigeria, working with colleagues such as Richard from the Department for International Development, where we took forward advice, assistance on economic, mostly macroeconomic policy, to help the Nigerian government at the time develop sustainably. And we had a number of tools that we could use to do that. My particular role in that as the UK High Commissioner, or Ambassador, if you like, in Nigeria, was to help open doors, provide access, facilitate, convene, and move things along in the right direction. Economic diplomacy is one tool, if you like, in the toolbox of diplomats. And there are many others, but I know that's the one that you want to focus on, so we can go into more detail in later questions.
Thanks, Paul. So, how does it differ from traditional diplomacy or more broad diplomacy? What's the big distinction?
Well, I would say that there's not a massive difference. As I said, it's one facet of diplomacy. But if by traditional diplomacy you mean what ambassadors used to do in the old days, they were focused very much on the political situation in the country. They were looking at the broader relationships, building those relationships, negotiating, conflict resolution, that kind of thing. That's still very much part of what a diplomat does. But increasingly, as time has gone on, governments, and the British government is among those, have decided that economic diplomacy is a very important tool to pursue our own objectives. And that, as I said, can take all sorts of different forms. I suppose trade diplomacy, in the broadest sense, is something which has been practiced for centuries. So the trade relationships between the major powers has always been an important part of diplomacy. But we've seen, and now in particular in developing countries, that there's a more nuanced way of looking at it, which includes a lot of different aspects, which I'm sure we can go into.
Thank you very much, Paul. So, from your very extensive experience, how often is economic diplomacy genuinely aimed at fostering sustainable development? I think this question is especially crucial in the face of America First and all the other form of foreign policy that we have been seeing this year. So, how often is economic diplomacy genuinely aimed at fostering sustainable development in partner nations? This is versus securing benefits for the home country. Do you think that it differs based on country? So does the way the US do it, is it different from the way the UK does it, and or is it pretty much similar?
I think different countries do it in different ways. You've mentioned the US. Obviously, I'm very well aware of how the UK does it, and even the way the UK does it has evolved over time. What we're seeing, I think, in the US and in particular in the Trump administration is a much sharper focus on the benefits which accrue to the United States, and less focus, less emphasis on how development assistance can help other countries, partner countries, develop in an economically sustainable way. So, for example, in Africa, the US engagement in Africa under Trump is much more focused on deals around critical minerals, around agriculture, about ways in which UK companies can export or exploit natural resources in those countries. Whereas I think for the UK, we are seeing a sharper emphasis on what the UK calls its growth mission, which is about helping the UK develop economically, but also I think not losing some of the benefits to the partner countries of that kind of support and assistance that we can provide. China is another point, a different case again. People used to accuse China of forcing African countries, developing countries, into debt traps without giving much in return. I think that's a bit of a simplistic way of looking at the Chinese approach to the continent, to Africa. Often you see Chinese companies building critical infrastructure without which no development can happen in these countries, but still with a sharp eye on their own benefits. So again, it depends on which countries you're talking about. I do think that development assistance can be used in lots of different ways. From a UK perspective, I like to think anyway that it's not just about how we can promote the UK's growth, but how we can encourage investment in partner countries, which will benefit those countries as well as the UK. In other words, a win-win situation for both sides.
Thanks, Paul. Can you give a few examples then from your time as High Commissioner in Nigeria or whenever else of where you really put this economic diplomacy into action, whether for helping countries to pursue their own long-term economic development objectives or whether for the UK interest?
Yeah, well, maybe starting with UK interest in the first place. I mean, I was High Commissioner to Nigeria, but before that I was British Ambassador to the Netherlands. And one of the things I was told before I went to the Netherlands was to help British business, to help UK companies export to the Netherlands, but also to encourage inward investment into the UK from Dutch companies. And this was a kind of classic example of economic diplomacy from the trade perspective rather than the development perspective. And just to give one example there, Heineken, you will all have heard of Heineken, big multinational brewing company based in the Netherlands, were considering where to put a massive brewery, a big factory producing beer. The UK, Manchester, which is actually where I'm from, was one of the options, but there were other options in Eastern Europe, for example. And the board was coming to a point where they needed to make a decision about where they made this massive investment. Because I had developed the connections, because I had developed the links with the CEO of Heineken, and I knew him well personally. I was able to get access to him and his board, talk to him about the benefits of investing in Manchester, together with some of the tax advantages which the UK government was prepared to offer, and encourage them to think hard about where they put their investment, giving him lots of reasons, lots of arguments. But if I hadn't developed the kind of relationship which diplomats need to do as part of their working lives, their daily routine, if you like, I wouldn't have had access to the CEO, and I wouldn't have been able to put those points to him. Anyway, it turns out that they went for Manchester, which I was very pleased to see. That's not just because I went in and persuaded him, but I think it's a good example of where economic diplomacy for the benefit of the UK was a successful initiative. When it comes
Can we
to
just
Nigeria,
pause on that one, just before you move
yeah,
on to the Nigeria one? You mentioned about sort of how the importance of relationships in this. To what extent, when it comes to these sort of big investment decisions, do you think it's about that person to person relationship, trust, all the rest of it? And to what extent is it about the cold hard facts of the investment? You know, what's the tax benefit going to be here versus the other country? How, as a diplomat, how do you see that?
I think both are essential, and it does depend on the country, obviously. So in the case of the Netherlands, the case I gave, a lot of it is around cold hard facts. Nevertheless, the fact that I had a good sort of friendly working relationship with the CEO of Heineken meant that I could get access. I could literally get through the door in order to present those cold hard facts, and in order for him to start to think about it. And developing that relationship took quite a long time, but it was something that I worked on and proved to be particularly useful in this case, but in other cases as well. The Dutch are pretty hard-nosed about business, and they will basically make a decision based on their own interests. But they also understand the importance of personal relationships. In the case of Nigeria, I would say personal relationships are quite possibly the most important element of it. So again, you have a sort of different approach where I would spend time to get to know the key people, the key stakeholders in Nigeria, develop those personal relationships, understand what motivated them, help them understand where the UK was coming from. I would never start a meeting in Nigeria without asking about the family, but without checking in on the kids, about how they're getting on at university in the UK, whatever it was, whatever the connection was. Always spend time creating, nourishing, nurturing those personal links. And that is time that is extremely well spent in Nigeria. In the Netherlands, it may be felt as a bit kind of unnecessary. The Dutch want to get straight down to business. So part of the skill, if you like, of being a diplomat or an effective diplomat is to understand the cultural context in which you're working, which I think is what you're getting at here, Richard, and say to use your knowledge of the country, your knowledge of how people interact with each other and with foreigners to your best advantage. In the case of Nigeria, to go back to your original question about examples, well, there were two that I could think of that you and I both worked on, and I'd be interested in your perspective of how you saw it working. The first was pretty early on in my time in Nigeria, when the then central bank governor, Godwin Emefiele, decided that, with encouragement from the president, decided that he was going to impose very strict foreign exchange restrictions on companies. In other words, companies were not able to access foreign exchange, and foreign companies wishing to export or rather to bring back home their profits were not able to get their dollars out of the country. This created bottlenecks, it created tensions for British companies, British Airways, for example, who at one point were threatening to shut down their connections with Nigeria. Diageo, Guinness, other big British companies who weren't able to get their money out in its simplest form. But it also created problems for Nigerian companies, which were so often dependent on importing goods for their businesses, whether that was construction materials or telecoms and the hardware of everything that's necessary. And they were suffering as well. So using, as I was talking earlier about those connections, I, working with you and others in the British High Commission, basically set out a strategy as to how we were going to approach these issues, both in terms of helping British companies get their money out, but also in helping the leaders, the stakeholders, the central bank governor, the finance minister, understand the damage that this was doing, not just to Nigeria's reputation as an investment destination, but very specifically to Nigerian companies who were not able to import. There were restrictions put on a whole range of goods, ranging from toothpicks to private jets at the time. And they had their reasons, one of which I think was to sort of sustain a strong naira and keep control of foreign exchange in the country. But the consequences were very significant. So what did we do? And Richard, you come in on this as well because you were very much involved. We, through diplomatic engagement, we spoke to the key stakeholders. I had several meetings with the central bank governor, with the finance minister, to explain about the issues, the problems specifically for British companies, to also say in a hopefully respectful way that this was damaging to Nigeria overall, damaging to the reputation of Nigeria. I had very specific examples of British companies who had decided not to invest in Nigeria because of these FX restrictions. But also to explain that, I had heard from Nigerian companies that they were suffering as well. Secondly, we supported Nigerian voices. So we talked to and created platforms for Nigerian companies to have access to the decision makers in Nigeria to put their own case. Ultimately, it's a much more powerful argument if you can use voices from the country itself to try to persuade the government to change course. And we were able to facilitate that through various platforms for fora that we facilitated and convened. And thirdly, we were able to provide technical advice through DFID, the chief economist. I remember hosting Stefan Durkon, the chief economist of DFID at the time, to come out and again, in a respectful way, but in a firm and clear way, to suggest solutions to ways in which they could sort of get out of this bottleneck, these measures, which were essentially a short-term handbrake on Nigeria's economic prosperity. And so a combination of these levers, of these tools, helped to get the message across. There were some improvements over time. There was an import-export window, FX window, that was open that made things a bit easier. There were some individual cases where the central bank governor, sometimes reluctantly, agreed that they could repatriate their profits. And slowly over time, I think we did have an impact, although this mantra of the strong naira still was very much something that was, I think, driving the policy. Richard, you were very much involved in this. I don't know if that's your recollection as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. And I think you sort of allude to this deeper impact here of like almost a romanticism around the strong naira, right? That the strong naira represents economic strength, and that it's almost the same, I guess, as what Trump is doing with America when he talks about sort of tariffs and how he wants to use his tariff. When economic policy starts becoming a thing of the heart rather than a thing of the head, usually it's not a good sign, right? Usually we're in for a period of contraction and lower growth and all the rest of it. And I think the challenge with Nigeria was the strength of the naira became romanticized and became a thing of the heart as opposed to a thing of the head. And as a consequence of that, as you rightly said in your explanation, there was a degree that the handbrake was left on the economy as they tried to do everything to protect the naira at that stage. That said, particularly more recently, there's been times where, as a result of the devaluation, inflation has really shot up for the Nigerian population, and so I suspect that's going to be a future barrier as well to further weakening of the naira. Is that people just should associate a weak naira with hard times? Favor, I don't know if you have any quick thoughts, given a Nigerian who's lived through the more recent currency devaluations.
I think it always hits harder for the citizens, but it's a matter of wondering and thinking that if these decisions are being made, if at the end of the day, if it's hard for us now, but do they have a greater good? And I think just as Paul was saying, it was a matter of, okay, you are taking this step because you think this is the way to strengthen your naira. But on the long term, or when you look at the numbers, it was actually hurting Nigerian businesses. So I think we don't mind, not that we do not mind the hardship, but if does it have a payoff? And that's the question that we'll be asking, that in the long term, will this benefit us? And if the answer is no, then I think that it's not a decision that we would want to support.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Favor, and certainly, Richard, you're right to point to the very depressing, very distressing impact that inflation is currently having on Nigerians' daily lives. Although I do note that it is gradually coming down. On the other hand, you need to look at both that aspect of it, but also the aspect of encouraging foreign investment and foreign direct investment into Nigeria. If done correctly, and if people come in with the right motivations, can make a huge difference to the lives of Nigerians and others in the developing countries that are affected by this kind of thing, through creating jobs, through creating opportunities. And I think governments, going back to the UK role in this, governments do have a role in providing, if you like, a bridge between the private sector, the companies that are looking to invest, and the policymakers in a particular country. Partly because we have the ability to reach out to both sides, partly because through expertise such as that provided in those days by DFID, yourself and your colleagues, Richard, we have something really valuable to offer. We're there as facilitators, but we can also help to steer things, nudge things in the right direction if we are clever, if we're sensible about using the tools that are at our disposal. And right now, Nigerians are going through a hard time, but inflation is coming down. The gap between the parallel market rate and the official rate is very, very small, and the naira has stabilized. Among other companies, I work for a big telecoms company in Nigeria, well, across Africa, and one of the things that company is looking for is stability, currency stability. If you can project what you're going to have to spend or what the currency rate is when you're importing essential goods, then you can plan and project, and you can then invest very seriously in the country through, in this case, rolling out 5G, rolling out networks, fiber, home broadband, improving digital inclusion, which ultimately is going to help the citizen. So there are really close connections. There's a connectivity, and I know this is very much going to the heart of what you do on Flywheel Economics and the podcast. There are this real connectivity between the lives of people and policy makers' decisions. And where diplomats can come in is help to open that box, help to help both sides understand the benefits of a particular course of action.
Thank you, Paul. I think that was very well put. And so just taking our discussion back again to international development, how do you think aid or international development assistance fits into a diplomatic framework?
Well, it's interesting to see the shift, the evolution, if you like, in international development assistance in recent times. I mean, Trump is perhaps an extreme example of that, where development assistance, such as it is, because he's cut back massively on, indeed disbanded effectively the USAID and many of its programs. For him, it's all about the benefits to the US. I think for other countries, the UK included, aid and development has to have a kind of multifaceted approach. First of all, if it comes to saving lives and essential humanitarian assistance, then it's crucial that those countries that are able to help in order to save lives should do so and should step in. So maintaining humanitarian support for those most affected by poverty, by climate change, by conflict, I think is still an important pillar of development assistance. You then have other areas such as health and education, which without a healthy and educated population, you're not going to have economic growth. People talk about the demographic dividend in countries like Nigeria. If it goes the wrong way, then it's less a demographic dividend as a demographic disaster. And you have a lot of people, young people coming onto the job market without the skills, and in some cases without the necessary health to pursue the opportunities which should be there. So helping in those areas of health and education remains, to my mind, important. And I no longer work for the British government, so I can be critical of them. I do think that they've cut back in some of these areas in a way which is very unfortunate. There are other means of providing development assistance through multilateral organizations such as the UN, such as Gavi, the International Vaccine Alliance, where it's still important that we continue to provide assistance and money for those. But then bringing it around to the economic diplomacy side of it, I do think that there is a renewed focus on, should we say, moving away from small scale particular sector engagements to something which is a benefit on a broader scale. So focusing more on technical assistance, for example, focusing more on helping policymakers get their policies right, rather than, I don't know, helping farmers in a particular state in Nigeria. I was very struck. I went to a Chatham House seminar at which the Nigerian foreign minister spoke, and it was just around the same time that Trump had announced the disbandment, or Musk was involved in disbanding USAID, and the money was being cut. And there was a question at the end of his talk, how is this impacting on Nigeria? And he said, well, if you look at it, we have 100 million farmers in Nigeria. $200 million for 100 million farmers is $2 each. That really isn't going to make that much difference. We need to step up. And I think this is a really important element of what's happening, is that, ultimately the point of development assistance is that ultimately you no longer need to give it, because these countries are able to stand on their own feet. And some countries are able to step in, vaccines, for example, and pay for it themselves, and are encouraging others to do that. Others where you have a great deal of poverty and government without really many resources are suffering massively as a result. Focusing on technical assistance, focusing on scaling up, focusing on ways in which development aid can be given through these large organizations which have a big impact is, in my view, the right way to go. But if you forget health, if you forget education, if you do not provide humanitarian assistance, then I think you're showing that you are solely in it for the benefit of your own country and not for the development of partner countries.
Thanks, Paul. So when we were in Nigeria, you and I was working for DFID, you were the High Commissioner. DFID was a separate Department of State from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, right? To what degree did you see DFID as being a sort of an asset to your foreign policy toolkit? Or to what degree was it a distraction and let me say annoyance, but what degree was it something where it's like, well, we're not coordinated enough and all the rest? How did you view DFID in that time, obviously before the merger took place?
I view DFID very positively. I mean, that was from both my personal experience, but also from the potential that I could see in using DFID, if you like, and DFID funds and DFID expertise as one of the tools in my diplomatic toolbox. So, for example, if I was going to a particular state in northern Nigeria where DFID have had active programs, it was always much easier to have a revealing, a useful, constructive conversation with the governor of that state if I was able to go in and say, well, look at what we're doing here to help your people in your state. And it wasn't just about the money, it was about the expertise, the technical abilities of those who were working DFID at the time in a whole range of areas. And I think certainly at the time, and as you say, the DFID and the Foreign Office now being merged, at the time it was extremely valuable. I did not see it as a distraction. I think we had to work hard to ensure that my priorities as High Commissioner were fully aligned with the priorities of the DFID team. And to that end, we created committees, we created platforms where we came together on a regular basis, if you remember, Richard, where we discussed particular issues as a mission as a whole, and had a single country business plan, which I think for the first time happened when I came out to Nigeria. And we were all then, I like to think anyway, aligned in moving forward on common objectives, understanding that each of us brought to those common objectives particular skills and particular benefits. And obviously DFID was a vital part of that.
Feel free to avoid answering this question, Paul, because I'm putting you on the spot with it. But do you think Boris Johnson was right to merge the Department for International Development with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office?
No. Do you want me to go further?
If you'd like to, yes.
No, I don't, because I think there were a number of reasons for that. One was that there was a particular brand that DFID had. And it was a brand that, as I've just said, was very useful to high commissioners and ambassadors around the world. That was a kind of unique brand, and DFID was seen as really probably the foremost of the international aid agencies providing assistance in developing countries. And that brand was at best diluted, if not completely disappeared, when there was this merger. I think that was one problem, which was a problem more perhaps of perception. The other thing was that the money obviously DFID's budget was significantly bigger. I mean, at least 10 times bigger than the Foreign Office's budget. And the Foreign Office, I think, saw DFID money as a bit of a honeypot, which they could use for other purposes. And again, that diluted some of the priorities that DFID had set out. There were practical issues around the alignment of terms and conditions and pay and all sorts of other things which complicated the merger. And I do think that as a result, the Foreign Office as a whole is less effective now than, or the FCDO as it's now called, than when we were two separate parts. The problem with two separate parts was coordination and alignment. But as I just said, if you worked at that, in particular, if you had a head of mission, an ambassador, high commissioner, and a head of the DFID office who were aligned, then there should never have been any kind of problem of conflicts of interest. And when that worked effectively, it was extremely powerful.
Well, just to add to your points that you've made there, with an example, when Shahbaz Sharif came in as Prime Minister in Pakistan, in his sort of opening speech, or one of his first speeches he made, he thanked the Department for International Development for their support over the years for his work in the Punjab province. This was even after DFID had stopped existing, right? So the DFID as a brand was still there in his mind, even post-merger and when it was FCDO as well. So I think there's a really strong point about the goodwill that had been built up over decades from having that Department for International Development. So thank you for your thoughts on that. Now that we're in the position we're in, though, with a merged department, do you see value in separating out again, or do you think, okay, well, maybe it was the wrong decision, but given where we're at, we should probably stick with it as it is?
I think it would be too disruptive. I think it was the wrong decision, but I think it would be a bad decision to move back to where we were. I think it would be too disruptive. What we've seen is the UK government's percentage of GNI going to development going down from 0.7 to 0.5 and now 0.3. and there isn't the money to make the same kind of impact that DFID was able to make when the UK government was devoting 0.7% of GNI to development assistance. And I just think that it's probably gone too far now. I see no inclination in the current government to go down that route, even though before the election the Labour Party said that they preferred to do that. I think once they've seen how complex that would be, they've decided against it. That's certainly my view from the outside of looking at it.
Thank you, Paul. So just staying with the UK, and as you mentioned earlier, there's a big push on the UK's growth agenda, and the UK's international development budget is being seen as a tool to help support this. But based on your own diplomatic career, to what extent do you believe that aid or international development assistance should be purely about the recipient country's development objectives versus the donor country's foreign policy objectives?
I don't see these as mutually exclusive. So I'm going to give you a typical diplomat's answer, which is both. As we're trained to do, look at both sides of the argument. But to go into more detail, it is important that UK taxpayers' money is used well, right? So this money has come from UK taxpayers. UK taxpayers have become less and less inclined to look at international development assistance as a good use of their money, right? And the support for ODA has dropped over time. And when asked the question, should this money go on UK hospitals and UK schools, or on helping Nigeria dig itself out of a hole of its own making, I paraphrase, something like 90% would say, of course it should be spent on us, not on them. But I think that's kind of short-sighted. And what I would say is that, if development assistance is to work effectively, it should be a win-win. Ultimately, if we're looking at Africa, if we're looking at Nigeria, we are looking at huge potential markets. We're looking at demographics suggesting that Africa will double in size in the next 50 years in terms of population. We're looking at middle classes which are customers, consumers for British goods. We're looking at the reverse. If you want to look at it from a kind of a negative perspective, countries which without sustainable economic development will have a huge pressure from young people who are not employed or not skilled or educated enough, who will want to migrate, will want to move to places where they can find jobs and more opportunities. So it's in our interest that we should spend money in these countries in order to provide them, or help to provide them anyway, with the right kind of, with a good education, good opportunities, skills, health. And, it's not the British government's responsibility to ensure that Nigeria has a healthy population. It's the responsibility of the Nigerian government to do that. But if we can help them along the way, if we can provide assistance, technical assistance, and expertise, then that's something which can only be to our benefit, because ultimately the consumers of the future are not going to be in Western Europe. They're going to be in Africa and in Asia, and we do need to make sure that we're ready for that, and that they are ready for that. So it's in our interest. Economic diplomacy is definitely in our interest, but helping countries to prosper is to their benefit, but also ultimately to our benefit as well.
Thank you, Paul. So thinking from the perspective of emerging economies now, to what extent do you think there are opportunities for economic diplomacy to be part of their toolkit for opportunities for the future? Do you see that this is an area which countries should invest in for their future?
I do. And I think it's important that they send diplomats overseas who are well versed in both in terms of economics, but also in terms of the trade opportunities. So there are ways in which embassies, high commissions in London and in wealthy countries can use the tools of economic diplomacy. This isn't just about asking them to help. It's about partnership and how can we develop the right kind of partnerships to enable that prosperity to take off. So making sure that the right people are in those places, giving them the tools to do that is important. It's also important that they themselves reach out in a way that I described how I and my team in Nigeria would go out and make these contacts and nurture these relationships. I do think that more of that can be done in London. It's something which I don't see often enough from some emerging economies. Some of them are good at it, others are not so good at it. And I do think that it's something that they can benefit from as well. It's really important that those relationships work and that they, for example, go out and give British companies good reason to think about investing in their countries. Some of them do that well. I was thinking of the Nigerian Investment Promotion Council, NIPC, under Yewande Sadiku, who was excellent in encouraging British companies and international companies to look at the opportunities. Some of them are not so skilled at it.
And then at the other end of things, I guess, as partners in country, what should, if you're interested in getting the best out of the British High Commission in Nigeria, what should the Nigerian government, what should Nigerian businesses be asking of the economic diplomacy from the UK? Say, if they're going to make the most of the opportunities, what should they be asking the High Commission?
I think they should be pointing out where the opportunities lie. I think that's the first point. So there are huge opportunities, and to give it Nigeria as an example, there are huge opportunities in Nigeria across renewable energy, across mining, across agriculture, produce, and so on. And actually pointing to those opportunities, but doing it in a way that encourages international companies, British companies, to look at them. So using the right kind of language, not can you come and build a factory in my state, please, and saying I will give you some land for that, but actually saying this is the way in which you can develop your business. This is the way in which you can benefit from the rich agricultural land that we've got here. Look at company X; they're doing well. This is a really good example, a case study, if you like, of how international companies are doing well in this place, and engaging directly with economic diplomacy teams, with the Department for Business and Trade, in these in the High Commission in Nigeria, elsewhere, DBT, and if not kind of coming forward with ready-made projects, at least alerting people to the opportunities. And that means going to the UK. It means not just the embassies based in London, but the right people going on road shows, explaining how things are. I think the mining minister in Nigeria is doing a good job of that at the moment, in coming over quite often actually to conferences to talk about the opportunities in the mining sector in Nigeria. So being a bit more proactive perhaps than they have been up to now, and developing the right kind of relationships is key.
Thank you, Paul. So you mentioned earlier about how economic diplomacy can be a win-win for both countries on the opposing sides of the table. So my question now is, how can it be made more inclusive and equitable, especially for developing countries?
Yeah, I think I remember from my days in Nigeria and working alongside Richard and other colleagues in DFID, they were insistent on putting kind of a number of lenses over potential projects. In other words, looking at the impact of any particular program or project on the youth, on women in particular, on rural communities. And I think that was a good discipline. It was a good discipline, in part because it's the right thing to do, because it's inclusive and it's helping to promote underrepresented members of the community. But it was also profitable, right? So you do the right thing. It's well proven that female entrepreneurs are generally more successful in SMEs, working hard in the informal sector than their male counterparts, for example. In rural communities, what can you do to promote digital inclusion, for example, something that I'm working with the telecoms company that I mentioned. Yeah, I think it is important. There are opportunities there. It's perhaps not done enough, um, and it shouldn't be the necessarily the single driving force, but it needs to be an essential component of any program, any project which is undertaken using developmental systems. I don't know, Richard, you've got direct experience of how that works in a DFID context.
Yeah, I think you were right with how you described it, Paul. It's there were different lenses that were putting on it. We had different advisors from different advisory cadres, and there was a very sometimes sometimes it felt too slow and too, it wasn't action oriented enough, but it was definitely very good at bringing different perspectives and ensuring that programs were designed in a way which really did include and bring different groups along. So it was both a strength of the Department for International Development and at sometimes something that slowed it down. But again, it goes back to your general point about the High Commission in a country which has, there's a cost of coordination, but if you can get it right, you end up with something more powerful. And so a bit of investment in the coordination can really pay off well. Paul, the final question that we've got for you, well, maybe the final question, let's see. Given the protectionist stances that we're seeing, from the US, other countries following suit, much more inward-looking approach to in economic diplomacy these days, what do you see as the future for economic diplomacy? Is it going to get better? Is it going to stay as it is? Is it, are we entering a new sort of depressing era of every country for themselves? What do you see as the future here on economic diplomacy?
I think the trend towards smaller development budgets, aid budgets, is going to continue, and I think that is it's sad, it's depressing in some ways, but it's inevitable as Western economies come under pressure of their own, and people are looking, as you say, more inwardly. They're saying, whether it's America first or, the UK interests above everything else. I think we're going to see that trend continue, maybe even accelerate. I think it therefore means that it's all the more important that what development is available is properly focused, that prioritized, that it is responsive to the needs of the countries that are the recipients, so that you're not just saying, we need to help women and girls in schools, but you're saying, how, you're talking to the government, how can we improve the lot of women and girls in schools? What are your priorities? How can we help with that? How can we provide, if we can't provide cash, if you like, money, how can we provide the right kind of expertise? How can we connect you to people in other countries who have succeeded in promoting the role of women and girls in schools and in education? So that's what we're going to see. The optimist in me would say the benefit of that is that you are encouraging partnerships, you're encouraging countries to focus on what really matters to their populations. And you are doing it with open eyes, and you're making sure that the taxpayers' money is best used in partnership with the recipient countries. The worry that I have is around the impacts on reductions in assistance to the health sector, in particular, to education to a degree as well. And to humanitarian assistance, which the three areas I mentioned earlier on, which I think need to remain essential pillars. And if we don't invest in those areas, and if we don't save lives, then what is the point of international assistance? So at the moment, I think it is heading in one direction. It's a direction that I'm not particularly comfortable with, because I think we have a responsibility, we have a duty. We haven't even gone into the colonial arguments, but nevertheless, the UK has a particular responsibility in Africa, in my view, not to hand money over fist to corrupt leaders, but to ensure that countries that could properly benefit from um, targeted aid do so in the right way. And economic diplomacy and supporting sustainable economic development is an absolutely essential part of that as well.
Okay, Paul, I said it may be the last question. I want to just add a little add-on to this. If you think about the UK's trade strategy over the years, certainly when you were High Commissioner in Nigeria, the sense that I had was that it was very much determined by existing investments, existing trade patterns, big companies like Shell, the fast-moving consumer goods like Unilever, Diageo, or all the rest, right? Yeah. To what extent do you think UK trade policy and trade strategy, let's say trade strategy, was it forward-looking enough in your view? How did you see the trade strategy? I know it wasn't directly in your control, but what was your thinking on it?
I don't think it was forward-looking enough. I think it was, well, to an extent, what you're doing is helping companies succeed and helping them succeed in the strategy which they have themselves set out. So, on the one hand, governments can't say to Unilever, these are the areas that you really must focus on in Nigeria. They know well enough where they're going to make the most profit and where they're going to benefit the most. And therefore continue to employ people or employ more people. So I think there's a risk in us saying, without enough expertise, this is what you should be doing as a company. Where I think we were slow was in not seizing some of the opportunities around renewable energy, around some of the kind of climate change issues. I think around insurance, fintech, that side of things. I do think that we were insufficiently forward thinking when it came to some of the wider opportunities in Nigeria. I'm not involved directly in government policy. I am involved very much in business in Nigeria, and I can see where the growth areas are. It's my role now to encourage businesses to look at that in a way that I wasn't able to do when I was under strict instructions from London to help company X or company Y. So that's one reason why I'm still involved in Africa. And hopefully still able to make a contribution.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me on the podcast.
Favour, it was really great to hear Paul and what he had to say, and obviously brought back a lot of memories from my side, from the areas where I worked with Paul on during his time in Nigeria. Lots of good memories around that. What were your reflections, Favour, around what Paul had to say?
It was nice sitting and participating in that conversation. Of course, just hearing both of you had good things to say about your time together. And my first takeaway would be, it's a point I've made on this podcast before, I've made on other episodes, just as a young professional stepping into just coming up on 2 years within this industry, and looking back on my time as a Nigerian living in a developing country and being very active on social media. A lot of times when we discuss things like foreign policy, it's always made out to look like this nefarious thing. And I think it's understandable given our history and like our colonial history, I mean. So a lot of people come with this mindset that, oh, these people are here to take over your country, your government is a shadow government. Those are the conversations that we have a lot of times on social media. But sitting with a former high commissioner and being in the sector myself and discussing foreign policy, it made me realize that economic diplomacy is just, as Paul said, to put it in his words, one of the many tools in a diplomat belt. And it's not just unique to developing countries. It's used across the world, whether you're a high income country, first world, whatever you are called. This economic diplomacy is part of the diplomatic process. It doesn't carry a nefarious intent as things can make it out to be on social media. And so that was a point, and I hope that a lot of young people, Nigerians and across developing countries, or whoever has previously misunderstood the concept of diplomacy, I hope they get to listen to this podcast episode and they're a bit enlightened. And another thing that I took out was on the non-exclusivity of a recipient country's development objectives vis-a-vis a donor country's foreign policy objectives, because we Paul gave us a really specific example about when we were having foreign exchange issues, and then the steps that the CBN governor was taking and the effect that it was having both on British businesses here in Nigeria, but also on Nigerian businesses. So to me, that painted the clearest picture of what economic diplomacy can look like as a win-win situation. And we asked Paul which one takes precedence, and he said a lot of times it's both can work hand in hand. And to me, I felt like that example was the clearest picture of what we mean when we say economic diplomacy. And maybe finally will be the most striking point. I saved the best for last, as they will say, when Paul talked about the fact that the point of development assistance is that one day developing countries or whoever is getting this assistance will no longer need it. They are meant to stand on their 2 feet. And I thought that that point was especially important looking at the development sector, the landscape that we are currently seeing. It's really been hard, and I know that a lot of lives have been lost, and I in no way take it for granted. But one thing that I would say is that this is a very hard wake up call to countries like mine, that these things weren't meant to be here forever. They were supposed to make us stronger, not make us dependent on them. And now that it's been taken away, it's like what's going to be our reaction? What are we going to do? It's time that we stand up. It's time for us to strengthen. That was the point, for us to strengthen ourselves as a country, as an economy. So yeah, back to you, Richard. What were some of your biggest takeaways from today's recording, from today's episode with Paul?
Thanks, Favor. And those are really good reflections. I'll pick up on your last one as it's fresh in my mind. I think a lot of the time that if you think about this sort of, where aid and international development works well, where economic diplomacy works well, it's when you have a very strong vision, a very strong leadership on the side of the recipient country, right? So there's a very big limitation as to how far you can go as an external player in terms of trying to encourage positive change if there isn't that strong leadership within the country that you're engaging with, because it will just, there's only so much you as an external player you can influence or shape or whatever things. It has to be led from within. And so where I would say in my career supporting economic reforms in Nigeria and Pakistan, where they've had the most lasting impact is where we've been able to identify what we call champions of change. So individuals that have a vision, have good leadership, are heading in a direction which is progressive for the future of their countries. And we can get behind those individuals and back them, whether with technical assistance support to help them in what they're trying to do, or whether it's with some degree of economic diplomacy, cover, support, whatever. And I think there are a host of people who used to work in the Department for International Development who were very purist about looking at their aid programs as international development programs, and that diplomacy was something that happened over here and international development was something that happened over here, and you shouldn't really muddy the water between the two areas. And I think a lot of the time we lost out a lot from not using all the tools in the toolkit. Because, for example, if I take an example from the work which Paul and I did in Nigeria, there was a time when the Office of the Auditor General was really had been really neglected by the federal government, quite frankly, under-resourced, I think the legislation that was behind supporting the Auditor General at the time, it was just the colonial legislation that had been left, right? It hadn't been updated since. It was seen as a bit of a dead end for a number. It wasn't the prime to be Auditor General wasn't seen as one of the top positions in government, and it had been really neglected from the Nigerian government side. But of course, if you're trying to get a system of accountability, a system where you spend money as a government department, and there's someone who's looking into how that money's been spent, how well it's been spent, all the rest of it, then you do need a strong Auditor General's office, right? And so what we were able to do from the UK government side was identify within the Office of the Auditor General some really amazing champions of change, people who did have that vision for the country, who did want to see it go further. We were able to work with the Public Accounts Committee within the National Assembly, the legislative side of things, which was supposed to take the reports from the Office of the Auditor General and was supposed to then call the government departments to account for what was in those reports. And we were able to, as an external player, just give a bit more shine the light a bit more on the potential in that area. So we could take the Auditor General and the head of the Public Accounts Committee to the UK to have a look at the Public Accounts Committee in the UK and the National Audit Office, which is our equivalent of the Office of the Auditor General. They could spend time together because we'd carved it out on this trip that the Auditor General, the head of the Public Accounts Committee in the House of Representatives, they could spend time together strategizing, thinking about what they wanted to pursue back within Nigeria. And we could provide technical support in to help this. And one of the ways which I felt very privileged in order to be able to draw on this tool was being able to use Paul's convening power as our High Commissioner at the time. So if there were areas that were locked up, which weren't making progress, we could say, I could ask Paul if he would host a dinner in the residency for the High Commissioner. We could invite the key players who were behind the whatever the issue was where things were stuck, and we could get them together in the High Commission to discuss the issues and for people to share their perspectives, and in that kind of environment hopefully get some progress on wherever there was disagreement or wherever there was wherever there was disagreement or things were stuck, give a bit of a platform in which things could be progressed. And I was very grateful to Paul that he was very generous in being able to use that space, because these things were not, there was no very strong UK self-interest in Nigeria being more accountable with its public expenditure and all the rest of it. Yes, from a development perspective, we wanted that, but you can't say, oh, well, that will make the UK richer as a result, or that's a nefarious agenda. It was one purely about Nigeria strengthening its governance over time. And I was very grateful that we had a High Commissioner that was willing to use his time, use his influence to help provide spaces where some of these problems could be resolved, negotiated, and all the rest of it. So I think using economic diplomacy as a tool alongside international development can be incredibly powerful. So, and I was very grateful for what Paul did to enable that in Nigeria.
That was a really good example, Richard, and I'm very fascinated to hear about it, considering the fact that I wasn't part of that process, of course. But I think picking up on your last point on what you said, that is a very neat example of how economic diplomacy or diplomacy can be used for international development objectives for in a country. And I think I would want to ask a question now, because just back to Paul's example, when we talked about the win-win situation that happened, how it was seen that, okay, yes, we could work for the UK's interest. We could say, oh, this is how it's affecting British businesses, but not that alone. It was also affecting Nigerian businesses. And so my question is that, to the skeptics, to people that will say, oh no, you people are just here to take our money or something like that, what would you say? Is economic diplomacy is it a necessity, or is it something that when we think about economic diplomacy, do we have more win-lose situations than win-win?
I think with economic diplomacy, and whether it's win-lose or win, win-lose outcomes are very rarely sustainable, right? So if you come in and you've got a trade deal and one party is at a clear disadvantage to another, the chances of that deal sticking and staying for the long run is really unlikely, right? These things unravel because at some point somebody wakes up and says, "Hang on, why are we doing this? We must be mad." So really, the whole gains from trade side of things, which is reflected in economic diplomacy, is that there should be mutual interest and it should be beneficial for both parties. That's why you come to an agreement. That's why you pursue something. Now, sometimes it may be that what one party is after isn't necessarily commercially of interest, right? So it could be like if we take the example of the Auditor General, there's no business win there, right? There's no UK commercial win on that side. It is purely about a development objective, right? But it just so happens that when the UK is defining its foreign policy, there are development objectives which are in there as well. It's not just commercial objectives. It's not just UK influence objectives and all the rest of it. So it is entirely possible for a win to be in there, which is a UK win, but it's about international development as well. And I think a lot of the time, a lot of how we've seen changes in the UK and the US over time has been about the balance of that. To what extent should we is that a lesser goal? Is that a higher goal and a more noble goal? To what extent should be that part of the package? Should we go more towards the commercial side than we have in the past? Or, should it be more about the UK influence and how we project that to the world? All these things are considerations and debates, and different individuals have different preferences on it. But I think we would be not telling the whole story if we don't look at the whole suite of objectives that there are. And if we just try and say, oh, it's just commercial considerations, or it's just UK influence, or it's just development objectives, then we fall into the trap of not really seeing the full spectrum of what's going on.
I've heard it once said that when we talk about balance, that a lot of times we think it's 50-50, but sometimes balance can look like 90-10. It can look like 70-30. So it's not just as you said. I thought that was a really good point. It's not just about, oh, it's all about development or it's all about commercial. It can be about both, but maybe sometimes, or depending on a circle, a year circle, or a season, one can be more pronounced than the other. But essentially, it's a matter of, okay, it's an ongoing process. I would say it's iterative. Today we say, how can we do better than we did last year? How can we balance it better so that we, both countries, both nations, it's at the end of the day, here at Flywheel Economics, that's what all we're about, the prosperity of all, the prosperity of citizens. And I think that is something that this episode is just bringing out the more, that when they are fighting for balance, it how does it look like? As Richard said, there are different arguments, but eventually it's a process, an ongoing process. And I know that maybe we'll get to where we want, where we intend to get to. But for now, we're still discussing it.
Yeah, and I think the important point so that's a very nice way of framing it, and I think we should also look at the fact that some of the percentages, some of the balance between those different areas is evolving over time, right? It's changing now as things are happening, right? So when the US decide they don't want to have they don't want to have US aid anymore, and they stop funding development through that kind of route, there's a rebalancing of the percentage of, okay, what are we doing towards commercial interests? What are we doing towards US influence abroad? There's a rebalancing of those percentages in a way. And the UK, when they just took the decision to not have a separate Department of State for international development, there was a degree to which that was going on as well. Not to say that there's no interest in development, because there is. There clearly is, and you and I, Faber, know from the work that we do that interest is still alive and alive and strong. But maybe it's gone down from what it was, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or whatever. With the UK growth agenda, as Paul was speaking to, maybe that again is about a rebalancing within the various the various perspectives. A budget of 0.3 down from 0.5% of GDP or GNI. That's also a rebalancing as well in terms of priority. So it's not that these things stop existing; it's that they change over time. But in a good, if economic diplomacy is working well, all of those lenses are operating, and all of them are coming together. And there's something I really like which Paul said, where we asked him about the merger, whether he thought it was a good idea or not, and he spoke about the necessity of coordinating, or the that how powerful it could be when you, as a high commission, you are coordinated. And so you have these, sort of three elements, if you like, working in harmony together. And it takes a bit of effort on the coordination side, but it's possible. And that being a sort of superior model to one where you just integrate one of the lenses within another, and perhaps it's viewed as lesser than the other, and all the rest of it. So really interesting to get Paul's thoughts on that and perspectives.
Yes, truly, indeed, it was. And because we are living in a complex world, I really would like that we could tie this podcast episode with a bow and be like, this is the solution. But we live in a complex world, and our solutions often need to be as comprehensive as the problems are complex. But I would really like to align myself with just a bit of what Paul said, talking about that, yes, developing countries need to begin to strengthen and see this as a push. How can we strengthen our own self? But things like when it comes to health, education, and conflict, that is where humanitarian assistance, things like that will always be needed, because when people are in crisis, we don't really stop and say, oh, how will this benefit us? How can we help? And that's what we're about here at Flywheel Economics, and what we're about in international development. So thank you very much to Paul for coming and just sharing his insights with us.
Yes, absolutely. And Favor, do you want to give a final conclusion? But before you do, can I just draw attention again? And I try and do this on as many podcast episodes as I can. At the moment, there is a petition on Parliament's website around the UK cuts to official development assistance, so effectively cuts to aid and international development budgets. I would encourage people to go to the Parliament website, and if you're living in the UK, to sign and support the work to reverse some of those cuts, because I think it's we talk about the rebalancing of objectives, and I think there's a strong argument that perhaps we've gone too far in a certain direction around the priorities between the three. Of course, people will have different perspectives, people will have different views on that, but if that's a view that you share, I would encourage you to add your name to that petition. Over to you, Favor, for the wrap up.
Thank you very much, Richard. The link to that petition will be in this episode's description, so kindly check it out and sign. So thank you very much to our dear listeners for coming alongside this journey with us. We hope that you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we did making it. Don't forget to head over to our website at flywheeleconomics.com and share your thoughts with us by following us on social media. Our handle across board is Flywheel Economics. Until next time, this has been the Flywheel Economics Podcast.